All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very cold and somewhat snowy Saturday. I am so excited because today I am meeting with two amazing local poets to celebrate National Poetry Month. So if you didn't know, April is National Poetry Month, and I am so excited to hear from Vicky and Max. So they are going to do some things today. They're going to share their work with us today, which I'm really excited about. And then we're also going to be kind of chatting and having a discussion afterwards about their work and also about their process and poetry in general. So if at any time you have any questions and you're watching this live, questions or comments for Max and Vicky, please feel free to put them into the comments below and we'll see them and we will talk about that as well. So at any time, feel free to jump in. And if you're watching this replay anyway, feel free to comment on it just to let us know that you watched the event and what you thought of it. So I am going to go ahead and get started by introducing our two amazing guests today. First, we have Vicky Jacobs, and this is their biographies that I wanted to read for you all. So Vicky Jacobs is a poet in the dusty heart of Southern Colorado. Jacobs received her MA at Colorado State University Pueblo, where she teaches creative writing. She is currently working on her MFA at Sierra Nevada University under the guidance of Patricia Smith and Brian Turner. Her poems and author interviews have been published in Read Magazine, The Flying Ketchup Press, Flint Hills Review, Titty Nope Zine, and other fine publications. So welcome, Vicky. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we also have Max Mendieta. So in writing about abuse he experienced as a child, as well as his battles with addiction, mental illness, and gender identity, Max Mendieta's aim is to bring about visibility and lend a voice for those who may be struggling with similar experiences. As a transgender male, the hybrid nature of prose poetry and creative nonfiction speaks to his heart and allows him the creative license to write in much the same way he lives. Max recently attained his Master of Arts with an emphasis in creative writing from Colorado State University Pueblo. He is now currently teaching rhetoric and introductory creative writing courses at the same institution. He has been published in CSUP's literary magazine, Tempered Steel, for 3 consecutive years. Welcome, Max. Thank you so much to both of you for joining me today. And as you can all tell, we have some CSUP grads on our hands that are also both currently teaching. So it's so awesome to meet local poets and local creatives in the Pueblo areas. So let's go ahead and start off by listening to some of Max and Vicky's poetry. So Vicky, would you like to start us off?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you so much for those awesome introductions. The first poem that I'll be reading is Bless Your Heart, Pumpkin and Honey Bunny, 16 down. Eggs and toast are steaming between us as I lean over the small space towards the half-finished crossword puzzle on crinkled paper. You're hunkered over a sports page stamped with rings, our packs leaning against the mangled orange vinyl of a diner booth. With my pen, I trace over the neatly lined boxes, narrowly framing the next puzzle clue. Words repeated by Samuel L. Jackson in the diner scene from Pulp Fiction. I recall this scene, Honey Bunny and Pumpkin bouncing from their booths to kiss, gripping guns in a diner, demanding wallets and paper cash. At the time, I wondered what desperation felt like. Was it the twist of hunger sliding through your body, or the hum of adrenaline that pressed against hips, pushing nails through trembles to rack your chest? Now, the feel of forcing shakes to stop is second nature. Just peel away thoughts and bury them. I think if we had guns slipped in the pocket of our packs, we would walk away with enough money to pay for a car. Instead of thumbing our way, we would drive across this scenic country. We'd hop from town to town, hoping to find a place that crept through skin and into our bones, somewhere that finally felt like home. We wouldn't be lost, wouldn't be strangers on every road our feet scraped across, or every ravine we slept in. Could I do it to belong? My lips firm, eyes focused, outside thoughts. I pen in the 16 letters and move on to the next clue. The next poem I will be reading is Remind Me What Woman Is, and this is after Adrian Mitchell's Human Beings. Watch my words, and not the shadow embedded in silhouettes. I'm not the fingertips, the parade on the skin of upper thighs, or Adam's taste for sin, not the rubber bands that slick back curly hair, the victim's cries, or bruising collarbones, or catcalls, hands on steering wheels, proposing rides, and not the poems. I've comprised what I am is rusting pipes and cold water in winter, gas cans, dying lighters, no food boxes this week, and handed down jeans or holy sweaters. I'm shelters and cold white-washed walls, school lunches and breakfasts in the summers. Look at my body with scars and crevices. I trace more than the curves of hips or breasts, more than biting lips against the fight for more, more, more. Is this what I have to wait for? Am I fixed on exploiting all that beauty? Remind me what woman is, and I'll remind you what it's like to be. And the final poem that I will be reading today is What Would Jesus Do? Hermes leans to one side as a red truck speeds towards him. It darts past like a bullet, stops with a spray of dirt on the side of the road, and hovers in a mass of exhaust. He picks up his pack, races towards the passenger door. The window rolls down, and the driver stares at the hitchhiker's makeshift cardboard sign, letters in messy black Sharpie. What would Jesus do? Adjusting his cowboy hat, the driver looks Hermes up and down. He spits sunflower shells into a mason jar and hits the gas pedal, forcing the kid to jump back. The cowboy's words melt into the screech of tires. He'd fucking walk. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vicky, for sharing those with us. All right, and Max.
All right. Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be here. And thank you to everybody who's tuning in and watching this. So I'll be reading a few poems. I'm going to start with Aftermath. Weeds whip shins, and dust devils swirl and choke and obscure. But when it clears and the cruiser pulls away with him inside, shackled and howling like a mad dog, her life is still there. And she, like molten metal, forged in cooling molds, folded small to cast out impurity, still soft on the inside, yet outlined with sharp edges. Knows he'll be gone for at least 3 days, leaving her and her mother to pick up the pieces in silent knowing. And now I'll be reading one called Childhood Therapy Sessions. The crack of aluminum on windshield safety glass. The whip of belt on flesh. The thuds of beat-up Nikes on rusted roof. The crunch of broken noses beneath clenched fists. Long past its last leg, our father's Oldsmobile Woody sits in the driveway, deflated, battered. Headlights downcast like the eyes of a scrawny child picked last. Weeds conquer rotting tires, a slow conquering, the kind our father likes too. Faux wood paneling hangs off the sides, rust flakes crumble to the ground. It's dead, I say. Let's kill it some more. We jump on the hood, a ragtag crew of country kids, deflated, battered. Baseball bats raised high overhead, ceremoniously poised, eyes squinting against the glint of sun on chrome, teeth bared, inflated. None of us picked last today, and commenced to smash whatever life was left to bits. And now my final poem is called Dead Space. My mother lived only in dead space, and she was not my mother at all. Like the kaleidoscope dreams of shattered glass, I see her face in every woman I pass. A Benson and Hedges trembles between index and middle finger as she absently lifts fingers to lips. Agony and misery spiral out after long, slow drags, blues and grays wisping out from between pursed lips. From his place on the dirty linoleum, Tonka truck abandoned, he glares with adoration at the woman he should love unconditionally. The saint he curses instead, as she sulks upon her altar, belly full of Bombay sapphire, tears of blood and mascara trickling down her cheeks. Like the halo of a fallen angel, smoke curls around her head before attaching itself to peeling wallpaper and cracked plaster ceiling. Shit-hued, nicotine-stained fingers chip away at flaking countertop that piece by piece fall into his hair.
Wonderful. Let's give a big round of applause to Max and Vicky for those beautiful works of poetry. I always love hearing the poet read their work out loud, because you get things from just reading it or yourself reading it out loud. But there's such an additional quality that you get when you hear the creator actually read their own work out loud. I feel like there's things that you really get from inflection and rhythm and all of that kind of stuff that you don't get otherwise. So thank you so much for reading those out loud. It really adds something special to your work to hear you read it. All right. That just gave me shivers. I'm so excited. I just love hearing it. So let's go ahead and start by talking about the poems that you read out loud. And just as a reminder to our viewers, feel free to comment on Facebook or YouTube, any questions or comments that you have as well for our two poets. So let's start, Vicky, and Bless Your Heart, Pumpkin and Honey Bunny. 16 down, you use great descriptions to talk about feeling, both physically and emotionally. How do you provide such vivid feelings for your readers?
I try to consider myself a storyteller before a poet. And through that, I have the ability to take bits and pieces from different genres. You know, in creative writing, everything's very fluid. All genres overlap, and you're able to build. So I take a lot of what I've learned through fiction and creative nonfiction and inject it into my poetry, whether that's creating a place or sensory detail. With this specific poem, Bless Your Heart, I wanted to incorporate the crossword puzzle a little more, so I created an acrostic poem out of it. So if you look down on the lines, there's 16 lines, including the title. It's Be Cool, Baby, Be Cool, which is Samuel L. Jackson's line, is the answer to that clue. And with that, with the crossword puzzle, it's so relatable to the reader, along with, you know, the smell of coffee, the look of steam coming off of eggs, the visceral feel of the vinyl. So I try to create something that the reader might have found themselves in. While they may not have had the exact situation happen to them, they're able to feel it through their own experiences, and adopt those emotions that I create through the atmosphere of it.
Yeah, I think your use of the crossword puzzle is great, and also of this popular media of Pulp Fiction, right? Pulp Fiction is like such a comedic and such a gory movie all at once. It really takes you along a wild journey. And so a lot of times I think like, oh, I would never be in a situation like that. But you really made me feel like I could be those characters or be in that situation. In your poem, Remind Me What Woman Is, it seems to be either a model or maybe better described as a response to what you mentioned, Adrian Mitchell's poem, Human Being. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So this poem is both modeled after Adrian Mitchell's poem, and it's a response to it. I had been struggling a lot with where my poetry was going and the content I was writing about. And I remember I had been reading through Being Human, which is an anthology by Neil Astley. And one of the first poems in it was Adrian Mitchell's poem. And I recall reading it and thinking, wow, this is amazing. This is what I have been trying to talk about in my own poems. And essentially, he discusses how we're all human. We're human first and foremost, and we're a collective. And it made me think about a craft talk, which was done by Stephen Graham Jones, where he mentioned that he is a poet or a writer first. I'm sorry, he's a writer first, and he is American Indian writer, or American Indian second. So with my own poem, I want it to be read with the content, not who I am. I'm not a woman poet. I'm a poet that writes about economic issues and income disparity. So my response to the poem, to Adrian Mitchell's poem, was in a way me realizing that it's okay. What I write about is okay, and it's important for me to focus on what I want to focus on rather than being simply a woman poet.
It's a great point too about writing about economic disparity and that kind of experience. When you, in that same poem, the lines about, I'm comprised, what I am is rusting pipes and cold water in winter, gas cans dying, lighters, no food. You go on to talk about, holy sweaters and lunches, school lunches and breakfasts. It was just a really great way to communicate that, those kind of experiences and that kind of economic disparity and hardship really forms a lot of your, not so much your personality, but maybe more the way that you identify and the way that you react to things in the future. So I thought that came across very well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And let's talk a little bit about some of Max's work as well. Max, in all of your work, I found a really interesting theme of this imagery between cars and nature, which kind of leads deeper into this idea of decay and organic growth, which I'm actually also really interested in. I love looking at like photos of dead malls and those kind of like abandoned places where it was, vibrant consumption and is now decay taken over by organic growth. What brought you to the exploration of this kind of contrast?
Thank you for bringing that up. And also I want to thank Vicky for describing her poems. It's always fascinating for me to hear other people's, the way I think we read poetry and we all interpret it in our own ways. And so I love hearing about other people's process behind their poems. I'm really glad you brought up decay and organic growth, because it really does highlight a lot of my work, both my poetry and my creative nonfiction. I've always really been fascinated with this sort of shedding process that occurs in the physical world. I think for myself and, for society at large, we have this kind of fear and aversion towards death. And I don't just mean death as in, of ourselves or loved ones, but death of our experiences or situations or of our past. And I like to, you mentioned malls, but I like to think about like fallen trees in the forest and how these trees die, but they don't really die. They hit the forest floor, and then they are responsible for all of this new growth. And I think the same is true of our experiences. And I write a lot about trauma and other things. And, when things do die, both tangible and not tangible things, there's this grief. There's always this grief. And so for me, poetry really is this heartfelt genre, and it allows us to touch into those feelings. And I think, with grief comes this, also comes great joy. And so I try to represent that not only for myself, this decay of, who I once was and these past experiences I've had, and then the growth that comes out of that. And I would like to, like Vicky said, connect to readers in that way, that, that there's this grief that comes naturally, but that there's also great growth that comes from it.
Yeah, that's such a great point about how I think it's somewhat a cultural thing, and maybe it's just a human thing too, that we don't like talking about death, we don't like thinking about death, and we definitely don't like celebrating it. Like you were saying, death of memory, of experience, anything like that.
Yeah.
I also found it really interesting how, and this might kind of play into where you were talking about trauma and past experiences and things like that. I found it interesting how location and childhood memory are so interconnected in your work. I not only feel like I'm really there, but I also feel like I am you. Like I feel like I can see childhood Max and childhood experiences ingrained with the location. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I'm also really fascinated with memory. So I think memory, especially childhood memory, and then going even a step further, traumatic memories are completely unreliable. And so I kind of think of my own memories as like this film reel that somebody has hacked to bits and then scotch taped it back together in, this completely out of order. I don't know if you've seen Fight Club, but it reminds me of the Fight Club scene where Tyler Durden is doing that with films. And so anyway, I think of my life that way as far as memories go. And so location for me is really important because it kind of like roots it down. It makes it something tangible and something I can hold on to. And so I like to merge those two together because, memory is so blurry. They've actually, said eyewitness testimony is one of the least reliable sources of evidence, right? Because our memory, we just kind of make, hodgepodge and piece together things. And for me, that's one of the reasons why I love poetry and writing poetic memoir, and because that's really representative to me of our memory. We have lines in between, or spaces in between lines. There are spaces in between stanzas, and then there are these spaces in between poems. And those spaces are equally as important as the words themselves. And so as I'm writing, I'm thinking about those spaces, those gaps, and how the gaps are just as important to me as the memories. And so location helps, kind of nail it down a little bit to where I'm not just flying off in these unreliable apparitions of memory.
That is such an interesting thing about the space between poems as well. It kind of reminds me of, when I read an anthology of someone's work, or when I listen to a music album, when you listen to just like one song, it's, you can have an experience, but the entire experience is the whole music album if they've done it that way. So yeah, that's a great point. I have a couple other questions about both of your work. I found a lot of really interesting themes that I think kind of overlap, but also have different exploration or communication with those themes. Your explorations of gender identities and experiences with gender, I found to be so poignant and interesting. So could you please share more with us about that?
Would you like to go first, Vicky? Okay, I can go first. So as you stated in when during the introduction, I'm a transgender male, and so really when I started writing, I couldn't really pick a specific genre or a specific type of poetry, and so I've always really taken to hybrid literature. And so my poems are, I like prose poetry, and I also write flash creative nonfiction. And so this idea of hybrid literature really challenges traditional definitions of literature. It's not this, but it's also not that, right? It's this merging of these two genres together. And so as a transgender male, I also challenge traditional definitions of gender. And it's like this merging between this and that. And so I think during a lot of my poems, I alternate between masculine and feminine pronouns. And then if you read my poetry, when I use the word she, I don't just write she, I write it as S\HE. And I think it's important as authors, poets, even, people who are, able to reach audiences to bring about this visibility, especially to controversial topics. And I know in my own experience, I spent many years closeted, where I passed as a male, and so that's just how I lived my life. It was like this great secret. And poetry is also a great way to express those secrets. Whether it's family secrets or just personal secrets. And I like to be a voice, right, and show that it's okay to be a member of the LGBTQIA community, and try to connect on that level, and show how beautiful all life is, and whether you're this or that, or you identify as neither or both, it's this really beautiful. It can be this really beautiful experience.
Yeah, I love hybridity in poetry. And I think, Max, what you're discussing is spot on. There needs to be that visibility. And if we can do it through form, even better. It shows that it shows physically what we're trying to speak and say. With my own work, I write a lot of experiences that could happen to anyone, either gender, any gender, and I write experiences of things I've seen from that first person perspective. So at times I try to adopt a voice that is, I don't want to say fluid, but it's a voice that can be seen as anything, anyone, simply because I don't want to be a voice for one specific gender. I want the ability to express myself and give the reader the ability to read it from their own eyes and adopt it with their own perspectives. So I don't generally focus too much on gender and identity, but rather, as I've said before, socioeconomic stances. When I do talk about gender, it's generally to do with things like sexuality or things that generally we're not allowed to talk about, in order to provide that voice.
Thank you for those very thoughtful answers. Yeah, that's, I did find it really interesting how I could see in your work, Max, how it was more about not necessarily being representative, but just being open with that experience and with those identities. And Vicky, I saw it more as in the second piece, Remind Me What Woman Is, but it was more rooted in that kind of socioeconomic experience, versus more of this idea of like fragmented childhood and memory with Max's work. I also noticed this idea, and maybe this is me also speaking with COVID and this whole idea of like human connection in such a weird time. But I noticed this kind of either this need or yearning, or maybe this ability to connect, but not necessarily connection in like the way that one expects, right? So not necessarily connection with a mother and child relationship, or connection with society, but rather one that was more intense, maybe more raw, but also a connection that existed kind of in the in-between spaces or on the outsides of what is expected. Could you talk more about this exploration or experience of connection or need for connection?
I write a lot about from a perspective of an outsider looking in. And I think a lot of us, I mean, especially artists and poets, but really just anyone can feel like an outsider looking in. And when we become obsessed with that, with trying to understand why these things are happening to us, or attempting to understand why we feel this way, we often overlook the beauty of where we're at and the situations we've lived in. When I meditate on these moments that I try to encapsulate within my poems, it's really me not trying to understand them, not trying to understand who I was, where I am, who these people around me are, but rather reflect on that moment and try to understand the beauty of it, try to pick out the bits and pieces that I may have ignored because I felt like an outsider. So I think with my work, it's more about encapsulating being on the fringe, and seeing the beauty of being able to reflect back into a society that I might not have or might still not feel a part of.
That was great, Vicky. That touches on this idea of being on the fringe. So I have a few things I'd like to say about that. I really do love this idea of connection and also this sense of like Vicky said, presence, where with trauma writing, a lot of writing about traumatic childhood events for me is growing up in an environment where I didn't feel connected to anyone or anything. And so I kind of, I incorporated that and brought that into my being and really like reveled in that for so long and yearned for it. And so for me, it isn't really this need or yearning for connection, but to see and show what's already there. And so, I don't think any of us are on the fringe or outside of connection. I envision like our world as like this spider web, where we're all always connected, and that by being connected, we send out, like if you touch a spider web, you don't just touch one part of it. It vibrates the entire web. And so there's always this sense of connection. And so for me, it's like breaking away from this duality, we get trapped in this sense of binary opposition. And because of that, we other ourselves, we other one another, and we other our experiences. And so there's always this sense of connection. And so I like to try to break away from that. And then something you said, Hannah, which I just love, is this idea of this space in between. And I'm a huge fan of this liminal space. And I think it's easy to think, that there's only certain times where we're in the liminal space. But for me, we're always in a liminal space. Even down to, like, we can think of, big times where we're in between the liminal space, like in between jobs or something like that. And so we're in this liminal space of the old job we had and finding the new job. But we're in the middle of a liminal space right now. We're in the space from when we started this panel discussion and the time when we end it. And so I like to explore that in my writing, this liminal space. And like I said, with talking about gender between this and that, this liminal space is the same thing. We're in between this and that all the time. And if we can, I think if I can remember that, that I'm in this liminal space, it grants the opportunity that Vicky was talking about being present with this current experience we have, instead of yearning for the next one, or wanting to get away from the last one, but instead embracing where I'm at right now.
Max, I love that you said you use liminal space and the idea of in between. When I think about creating stanzas and lines, right, we have the where we decide to have blank space and what we decide not to include within the content of the poem, what we're not saying, and it allows the reader to think about what it is we're not including. What are we trying to say between those spaces? What negation are we using in order to lead them into understanding where we're coming from? So it all seems very connected.
Yeah, definitely. I was just talking earlier about the spaces in between. And yeah, that's great that you brought that up, because that is like, the spaces are like a liminal space too, between what we said last and what we're saying next, and how that space is equally as important. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I love this idea of liminal space as well, going along with both of your work, talking about Max with yours with gender identities and experience, and then with Vicky with the socioeconomic experience. It's so easy for everyone to think in binary. Tim Minchin actually has a great song called The Fence, where he says, in any comment section online, you'll see that human beings are like, they're on a mission to divide everything cleanly into two categories. And there's so many of these clean categories between gender, and these clean categories between the haves and the have-nots in economic terms. And yeah, it's just really fascinating. I love how that theme plays out in both of your work in a very different way. Okay, let's talk a little bit about just kind of your process and journey as poets as well. I see a couple viewers, so if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. But I thought this would be really helpful for people that are inspired by your work, that are poets themselves, to hear more about your experience and process. So one very giant open-ended question is, how did you get started writing poetry and becoming a poet?
I didn't start until I was an undergraduate in my junior year, I want to say. Before that, I was an anthropology major, and I needed electives. So I took creative writing. I took it from the poet laureate of Kansas at the time, Kevin Rabis, and it was just it was a fun class, but the relief of being able to write creatively in such an academic setting made me want to continue. I was taking forensic chemistry at the time, and I remember, studying blood spatters and that kind of stuff, and I all I could think about was poetry. I just wanted to write poetry instead. So it began very late in my life, but I think that's helped me grow as a poet, because I'm able to look at things a little more fresh than if I had, begun writing a lot younger.
So I have a kind of a different experience, but also some similar experiences as Vicky. So I actually started writing poetry when I was young. I was a teenager, and I used it as just this emotional outlet. And so I would write down how I was feeling in the form of poetry. And then I stopped for a really long time, but I always really had this, the love for writing never really went away. I just stopped doing it. And then, like Vicky, the spark was rekindled. And it started with a creative nonfiction course I took at CSU Pueblo with Dr. Ivor Arnegard. And it was a CNF class. And he was encouraging us to write about past experiences. And it was the first time I had ever been so vulnerable in writing about some of the childhood experiences that I had. And I remember this, this sense of liberation, to see and hear other people being so vulnerable and courageous in writing about these things, and not just writing them. It was one thing when I was, 15, writing in my journal. It was another, like Vicky said, to be in this academic setting and to, put these words down and then to share them, not only with the professor, but also with other students. And so that kind of rekindled my love for writing and kind of put me on this path. And then, I kind of put it down again until I decided to get my MA and to have this emphasis in creative writing. And again, it was rekindled, this time with Professor Juan Morales at CSU Pueblo. And I had been writing creative nonfiction essays about my experiences. And then when I took his class, I decided to start writing it in poetry again. And so both of those professors at CSU Pueblo helped me really hone my skill, as a writer and a poet.
Yes, and a big thanks to Professor Morales because he is who got us connected with you. So I'm really grateful to him for introducing us to each other. It's really funny, Vicky, when you mentioned that you're studying blood spatter, the first thing I thought is like, oh, that would be so interesting to write about. So I'm on the same page with you in chemistry, but thinking about poetry instead. We're back into the theme of liminal space, I think, with this next question, talking more about your process with poetry and how your poems develop. One additional question I have along with the development of your poetry is, do you think of poems as something that is fixed in like a fixed state, time and place, where people can interact with them, but the poem is fixed however it is? Or do you see it more as like a living, breathing creature that changes as people interact with it?
I can speak to that because I've had some really cool experiences with my own poems. So I do think of them as these living, breathing creatures, but I don't think of them as being fixed and that they exist forever. It goes back to kind of like my experience with writing about memory, and how, it isn't fixed, and it, even though, these experiences happen, they're not so clear and concise. And so I feel that way about the poems themselves. Some of the poems I write, I shouldn't say some, all of the poems I write undergo this like metamorphosis. And some of my poems I write and then I go through the revision stages and they turn into something completely different. They're not the same at all as what they were when I first started. Sometimes I think they're better, and other times I, go back to what I had written the first time. And so they're never fixed, but they're definitely living and breathing. And also, we talked a little bit earlier about interpretation. And I think I write it one way, and I have this, and this has happened to me in like, sharing my poems and then hearing feedback. and I write, and I have this whole idea in my head about what it is and how I interpret it. And then somebody else reads it and they interpret it based off of their own experiences. And so it's very living and breathing in that way, where when somebody else interacts with it, they kind of make it their own. And so I'm like, we're back to this connection. I'm connected in that way where I'm writing this poem and then I'm giving it to you. And then it's your poem. And so I really love that, the way you worded that as poems being living and breathing creatures. I so relate to that.
I'm kind of on the other end. I don't view my poems as living and breathing. I see them more as a structure. When I create my poems, I visualize it as architecture. So I have this space that I feel I need to build into, or I need to fill in some way. And generally, I start with a line or a scene that I want to talk about, and that'll be my foundation. And then I build up. So I'll decide what kind of form, what kind of meter does this structure need, and I use that as the frame. And while everyone looks at things differently, right? When we look at something, we have our own memories, and we put our own emotions into it. So if we look at a castle, we're going to think about the stories we were told as kids, or the history we know. And I feel it's the same with poetry. It's we while we are looking at the content and what the poet has created, we're putting our own perspective onto it. But when I create poetry, I don't see it as living or breathing. It doesn't change, as in it evolves and grows. It's more as if, okay, I need to fix a window, or this bathroom doesn't work with the rest of the house, so I have to change that. What do I want for the aura or the atmosphere of this poem? Do I need hardwood floors on it, or do I need carpet? What's going to work best for this content and what I'm trying to say?
I love how our process, the way we look at our poems is so different. But also there's some similarities. And I love the metaphor of, the house, like this house that needs repair, or, revisions, I guess would be a good word, right? So yeah, that was great, Vicky.
Yeah, with the revisions, I've been writing so much that it's just, I need to edit the bathroom or revise the bathroom. It's just, poetry bleeds into your everyday life.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is a great point to bring up too, how different your processes are and how it bleeds into everyday life, because I think often there can be this idea that poetry is like some very intellectual, highfalutin, process. You have to be a genius, or you have to be struck by this inspiration, hit on the head like Isaac Newton, right? And for me, at least personally, poetry is not that way at all. Poetry is very accessible. It's very human. It's very relatable. And so, what do you think about this discussion of accessibility of poetry? Do you think your readers should have to solve the poem? Yeah, what do you think about that?
I think it depends on what kind of poetry the reader enjoys. I personally don't enjoy poems that are riddles, or I have to work to understand. I enjoy more political poetry, like Amri Baraka or Terrence Hayes. And so when I'm reading poetry, I want to be told what's happening and what the poet's perspective is on the subject matter, and what we can do in order to make the world better, because poetry is supposed to make the world better. It's supposed to have this ability to bring us together and open our minds. What about you, Max?
I agree with all of that. I don't, in my own poems and poems that I read, I mean, I like to read all different kinds of poems. And I think that's what's so great about poetry too, is that, like you said, Hannah, I think all poetry kind of speaks to this human condition. And that I think all of us who read poetry can find a poet or multiple poets who, speak to them, that we find this poet that speaks to us. And I do think, like Vicky said, we have, as authors, we do maybe have like this audience in mind, that we're catering to, right? And so with a lot of my poems, I talk about gender identity and mental illness and childhood trauma. And I imagine somebody who's had similar experiences, even just similar experiences with suffering, or, then that my type of poetry might speak to them. Something that I always tell my students when I'm teaching poetry, because I get that a lot. Actually, I have students that are like, I don't understand poetry. I don't know how to read it. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so I tell them, I try to encourage them to not read the poetry and interpret the poetry with their minds, but instead to try to read and interpret it with their hearts. Because I think I know I often, when I'm trying to figure something out like that, I have all these conceptualizations. And especially in an academic setting, if you're used to reading articles or essays or something, it's like, very intellectual. But with poetry, I don't think it has to be that way. I think some of it, at least the type of poetry that I like to read it with my heart and think about this human condition. So it's not like a puzzle, where I have to put all the pieces together. Again, I go back to this living, breathing creature that, poetry has a heartbeat. So I love that about poetry.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so just a couple more questions. I know we're getting close to the 1 hour. I could talk about poetry all day long, but I will edit myself. Do you have any advice for someone who wants to write and publish poetry?
Read poetry probably would be my first suggestion. Find the kind of poetry that you enjoy or that you would like to produce, and read it as much as you can, and then revise. That's probably one of the most important things with all creative writing. Is free write. Get those ideas, those imagery, the sensory details down there, and then revise and share it with others so that they can help you mold or build this piece that can be shared. One thing I always tell my students with submitting is you're going to get rejected. Everyone gets rejected. It's okay. There's clubs, there's many people who, and I do this as well. We try to get 100 rejections a year, just so that you're submitting enough. So submit enough that you're getting in those 100 rejections, and after the 50th rejection, it's nothing. They read your work. Someone out there read your work. They saw it, and they appreciated it enough to email you back or send you a letter back telling you, sorry, it doesn't work for this journal. It doesn't work for this chapbook, whatever they're working on. But that's okay, because your work isn't always going to be for everyone. It's not going to fit every mold. But if you love it, and if you're creating from, like Max said, your heart, and is giving other people the emotion and the feeling of heart with it, then you're doing what you need to do as an artist. But don't be scared of rejection, because there's no success without it.
Great, Vicky. I couldn't have said it better. I have all of the same advice, really, is to read. And I tell that even to my students who are not creative writing students, even if you're just writing academic, to read, read, read. And for me, reading poets, that's really what's helped me, is to read poets who inspire me, and to see how they, how they're getting, their thoughts and emotions on the page. And then it if I'm feeling like, like I can't write, I don't have anything, nothing's coming to me, I'm kind of blocked or something, then I just put it down and I pick up, whatever book of poetry I'm reading or something, and I just read. And sometimes I read for a long time before I'm inspired. And other times I read one poem and it's just like a light bulb goes off and I know exactly what I want to write and, how I want to write it. And then the next thing that I do personally is I get in my head and I get intellectual when I start writing. And so a problem that I've had is line editing, as I'm writing. And so Vicky said, mentioned free writing. And so that's really helped me, is to just free write instead of worrying about form and structure and rhyming and meter and worrying about all of those things. So first I just have to free write and get it down, because if I don't, then I'm line editing as I go and then I lose it. I'm all in my head and I'm not in my heart. And so then I lose the whole poem. And so really free writing first. And then, as Vicky said, I can go back and I can fine tune it and, get the structure down right. And then same as Vicky, is submit, submit, submit. And I'll be the first to admit, this is advice that I wish I took more often, is getting online and finding, literary magazines and journals that I want to submit to. But Vicky's right. There's lots of rejection. When I first started submitting, I was really discouraged because I just kept getting rejected. And I've talked to peers, like Vicky said again, to share your work and talk with other writers and learn that that's a part of the process, that as writers, that happens a lot. There's so many journals and literary magazines out there, and online ones and in print ones. And you would have, if you submit, to a lot of them, eventually you may get published. But rejection is part of the process. And, especially, if you have, for me, I have like this fear of rejection. And so it's easy for me to get sucked into this, discouragement. But it's important to also, just to get your work out there. And so just do it. And then maybe have a friend, that you can talk to if, these strong feelings come up, like, I just got rejected and I don't want to do this anymore. And then you can, talk to a fellow writer or even just a friend, that can say, it's not the end of the world, find another journal and submit it again, just keep submitting it. Which can be helpful in so many different ways, not just with, writing, but also with, dealing with these types of feelings and emotions that come up when we are rejected in so many different areas of life. There's always this rejection. And back to what I had said before, this idea of grief, it's so important to experience all of that.
And I would like to mention, along with, we both had mentioned free writing, try to handwrite. we don't often do that anymore. But get a journal that you can carry around with you in your pocket, in your purse, in a backpack. And anytime you hear a line of dialogue that inspires you, or you see the way a shadow falls on the concrete, write it down. And while you're trying to create the poem, whether it be through a forum poem or just a free write, do it on paper, because with Word or with a document online, you're gonna feel like you have to go back and edit it while you're writing, and that can get in the way of the flow of your art, of your words. So just try journaling it before transferring it onto your computer.
Yes, that's great. I actually, I love handwriting too. And what's so important about what Vicky is saying is that, if I have all of these just like random thoughts or just one-liners or something, and if I'm, in that space I talked about before where there's just nothing coming up for me, in addition to reading, I can go back and look at all of those notes that I've compiled and these, random bursts of inspiration that I had during the day. And I can go back and I've had many poems and stories come from just going back and looking at all these notes I've made and maybe even piecing some of them together. Another thing that I do agree with the writing by hand, but I also have, we all have this notes on our cell phones. And so if I'm in a place where I don't have my journal or, I don't have a piece of paper or a pen, I can just put it in there really quick. If we all have our cell phones on us probably almost 24/7 nowadays. So there's always this ability to put this stuff down, whether it's in a journal or if it's in the notes document on my phone. And then I can go back and look at that stuff and find some new inspiration. So great advice, Vicky.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderful discussion and getting to hear your work as well. Let's give Max and Vicky a giant virtual round of applause for sharing their knowledge and their work with us today. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you being open and willing to share with us today, and I know our audience does as well.
Thank you, Hannah. I so appreciate being here and given the opportunity to have this discussion with both of you. This has been a really great experience. So thanks again for having me, and thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Max, and everyone who's watching. Thank you for allowing us to share our poetry. It's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And happy National Poetry Month. And Vicky and Max both instruct at CSUP. Is that right? So if you're interested, you might see some of our patrons on your roster. Maybe that would be great. All right. So thank you so much again, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.